Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for joining this afternoon. I know many of you have a long weekend coming up, so we have prepared a presentation today that we hope will be useful. It's not a sales presentation, so feel free to ask probing questions at the end. My colleague Megan, Dane, and Chris spent a lot of time getting people signed up for this, and as well as the panelists, Matt Purcell and Mark, creating use cases that we'll share with you, as well as a recording of this broadcast afterwards. So without further ado, I'm just going to introduce the panelists. First, we have Matt Purcell. He's Director of Capital Planning and Development for the University System of New Hampshire, as well as Mark Lawson, who has 17 years of experience as Director of Real Estate at both Kennesaw and Georgia State Universities, and now is a consultant down near Atlanta. And I am Aaron Smith. I'm based up here in Portland, Maine, and I'm in charge of kind of the higher education market development. First on the agenda today, Matt's going to present a bit of a use case with the challenges he faces at USNH and what he's doing to address those. Essentially, there's a response to some changing market forces, the changing needs of both students and faculty, as well as all the market forces I'm sure our audience is familiar with as far as trying to attract and retain students. That case study is primarily looking at how to get more ongoing strategic value out of facility condition assessments, those third-party surveys that are done kind of routinely every 3 to 5 years, how to make better use of those. And then Mark will be following up with some options on the best ways to gather that data and kind of put it in one central repository to be able to make some strategic decisions with, better align those projects that you fund with what the strategic initiatives of the institutions are. Both of those will take about 10 minutes, and then we'll finish up with a Q&A session where Megan will read off the questions that came in. You can enter those in the kind of webinar box. There's an area called Q&A. You can just type your questions right in there under questions, and they'll be addressed at the end of the call. So first up, essentially, what we're talking about here is how well do you know the state of your campus as far as what are the top priorities, what are the conditions of your buildings, which buildings have a higher priority than others. These days, I know that sports facilities and shared common spaces are of utmost importance. So how do you, once you get that objective data from third-party engineering partners and your own facility staff, how do you prioritize which projects you fund and which to approach programmatically? Essentially, what we're trying to do is get you from the current state of knowing what you have to where you have to improve, to what would be the best allocation of capital and resources, and then ultimately having the data to back up your budget requests. So in the unlikely event that there's some windfall of capital, or you have to justify why you're spending money on one college versus another one, you can have the data to back that up. So first up, I'm going to introduce Matt. I mentioned him before, but Matt, why don't you introduce yourself?
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Matt Purcell. I'm the Director of Capital Planning and Development for the University System of New Hampshire. USNH is the largest provider of secondary education in the state of New Hampshire. We maintain and manage the largest capital asset profile of any entity in the state of New Hampshire, and it's distributed across 3 main residential campuses and also in some major satellite campuses in Manchester, New Hampshire, and Concord, New Hampshire. Our flagship institution is the University of New Hampshire, located in Durham. And then we also oversee Plymouth State University and Keene State College. We have about 32,000 students attending our institutions, of which 45% of them are from outside of the state of New Hampshire. We have an extremely high graduation rate of 69%, and we actually have one of the lowest default rates on loans. So we've got a pretty solid reputation of graduating high-quality students. Our building portfolio consists of about 430 buildings across those campuses, which is about 9.3 million gross square feet. We actually have a facilities condition index. Hopefully everybody understands what that is, of about 24%. And our intent is to maintain that Facilities Condition Index. Right now, we recently completed a facilities condition assessment of all of our campus and have identified approximately $705 million worth of investments we need to make to maintain that current facilities condition index over the next 10 years. Next slide. So what we were facing is, I've been involved. I came to the University System New Hampshire 3 years ago and came in looking at the facilities condition information that we had, which was the last time we had done an assessment was in 2007. And much of that data was very outdated, was not current, and did not give us a really good snapshot or understanding of the conditions of our campus. Much of the cost data was completely out of date, and to the point that none of our campuses were using them at all. They could not feel as though they could rely on that cost data. Really did not have it was very clear from the beginning that we did not have a very clear understanding of our campus priorities. That was very evident as I looked at the capital plans that were being proposed for the first year that I was here. And the data that was in our database, our online database, was very difficult to pull out. It was very engineering oriented. It was basically a big database with a lot of information, but it was very difficult. So essentially our campuses were pulling the data and putting them into spreadsheets. And so there weren't really reports that they could be generated from the system. It was reports, they would pull the data off, update it, massage it, change it, and then export it through spreadsheets into reports, which also brought us to a big issue with a very big inconsistency of reporting or understanding the conditions of our facilities across our different campuses. Then to add to that, we've also got a lot of external pressures on maintaining our campuses, as many of you in higher education know. We've had a significant increase from the trustees and their focus on deferred maintenance, and to the point that prior to my engagement here, they had come up with the trustees had established a policy by mandating that the institutions spend 1 time their depreciation value on the campus to maintain their current facilities. It just so happens we actually work with Sightlines and have them do their annual report for us. And it's kind of interesting that the depreciation value of our campuses aligns pretty much with what Sightlines says we should be investing in our campuses on an annual basis to maintain them in the current state. But then we have to add all to that is that New Hampshire is, well, it's not unique that we've seen significant reductions in state appropriations, even though we're a quasi-state institution. Currently, New Hampshire is the lowest funded state in the nation per student. So, it makes things difficult for us to operate and maintain our facilities when we have continual reductions and also criteria on how much it costs for students to go there. Which also ties back to the increased pressures we're seeing on reducing our tuition costs to our students. Add that for some other external pressures is that we're also looking at the changing pedagogies and student expectations. As many of us know, we're seeing a greater demand for flexible teaching spaces, and that requires different infrastructure and different support of our academic spaces. Also, we're finding, students are all looking for additional amenities and making it more as if it's as if it's home. And what we're seeing is obviously we've got a lot of our residence halls were built in the 1960s, and they're the double-loaded corridors with no common space. And as we're going in to do renovations, we're finding that we have to add common space and more lights and a number of different amenities. Now and also looking to add more of a home atmosphere where they have an ability to cook and have gathering spaces, which ties it back to the students are looking across campus at all of our institutions, looking for communal spaces for collaboration and social activities. We're also seeing an increase as it comes down to our athletic facilities, looking for higher quality, safer, and kind of the newest and the latest in campus facilities. And then finally, as we're looking at it from internally, as we look at our assets, which are our facilities and buildings and infrastructure, at the university system in New Hampshire, 50% of our buildings are over the age of, or more than 25 years old, and 22% of all of our facilities are older than 50 years. Many of those that were built in the 60s and 70s are typical of that vintage. Not easy to renovate, not easy to change to be more effective with the current requirements from our students and faculty. And then you add on to that, as anybody in higher education knows, that our newer buildings are far more technologically advanced and require greater investment and greater input to keep them operating in an effective manner. All right, next slide. So what we were looking for from the university system perspective was we needed to find a easy to use and intuitive platform that would allow our campus facilities staff to straightforwardly update the work data and allow them to interact with it more, and to have a system that acted more holistically and to store our facilities data so that we had a better ability to keep it current. And then to provide real costs and real understanding and being able to update that cost data on an annual basis based on whatever the escalation expectations were. And then next is we made a conscious decision that we were going to go back and do a facilities condition assessment on an annual basis of a minimum of 10% of our facilities. As we all know, it's very expensive to outsource this and go to external entities to do it, engineering firms. And we decided that we will do a certain percentage of that every year or every other year internally with our own staff independently. So that what we needed was a platform that would allow us to be able to go out and work with that information and input it back into the system that we were looking at. And then taking all of that data and being able to manipulate it to generate some consistent reports across the campuses that were easy for our trustees and administration to understand was a critical factor in being able to not have to go through a lot of massaging manipulation to get that data real, so that they can look at a quick dashboard and understand where we were with our campus. And we also were looking for, there's a number of different criteria we were looking to add into that analysis that we didn't have to bring in from the outside. Things such as looking at the age, the type of project category, whether it was a repair or maintenance, modernization, or infrastructure project, and then some of the investment criteria, the reliability, asset preservation, whether it was safety and code, or programmatic improvement, or an economic opportunity. We see those quite more often than that we're seeing ways to be able to flexibly use our facilities across to generate revenue for our institution. And we also wanted to make sure we were prioritizing and addressing the critical projects related to our facility strategic planning across the campuses. So next slide. So what we really wanted to do is to go from, a historically reactive perspective. What we were doing is basically, before that is, really it was last minute planning often. Something would rise to the top of our list, that year going into it, and maybe we budgeted or maybe we didn't budget it. We were finding ourselves dealing with a lot of unplanned maintenance programs. And what we wanted to do is turn those more into planned maintenance programs and tying this better to our strategic plan and to our master plan as we move forward. So we had more interaction with our strategic planners and our academic planners. So what we're finding is that because of the mandates from our trustees, because of a lot of these externalities, we're finding that deferred maintenance projects are not taking a back seat to some more of the academic and kind of academically strategic projects. But it's also allowing us to really do better planning with and effectively utilize our limited funding that we have. So we're no longer wholly relying on the operations personnel to provide feedback, but now we're being able to provide a little bit more balanced approach across our institutions on our spending. Aaron, back to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Matt. It's been very interesting to work with you so far. I know we have a lot to do, but just to give everyone a view of what we've accomplished so far. So Matt had mentioned a bunch of old engineering studies as well as Sightlines as a data source. So we imported a bunch of those more engineering spreadsheets as well as some of the information from Sightlines to build an example of the dashboard is here. So this is kind of aligning the collaboration between the finance and the facilities staff, where you can see some rolled up aggregate views. You can see, for instance, in the bottom right corner, sort of across the USNH campuses, where that backlog of deferred maintenance is primarily and what plan types it's associated with. So, for instance, you talked about trying to look at student housing and modernizing those areas to put in more common centers. That could be some of the capital renewal that you plan in there. You can see a lot of that life safety versus code compliance, and of course the life cycle stuff, which is more of the backlog of deferred maintenance. And I know similarly for many of you, your budgets are based on last year's spending. So having a view forward looking really helps, which is in the upper right hand corner, just gives you an understanding of what you have coming up that may be more problematic, just to manage expectations with finance. I know one of the next steps Matt had identified is tying out this to the Banner financial system, just to get some actual costs in there. A lot of these are modeled based on our cost library of estimated useful life and replacement cost, which is that FCI value, giving the FCI value that Matt mentioned previously. The other data sources, some of the questions we often get and are coming in now are about how we get data on the platform and where it comes from. So certainly, empowering your own facility staff to report onto the database and keep it updated really helps, because there's not as much of a gap between the operational reality and what the platform says. So you spend less time on that debate and more time trying to prioritize what projects you're actually going to do. So next I'm going to introduce you to Mark, and Mark's going to talk about some different options to achieving some of these things from a more strategic perspective. So Mark, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
All right, thanks, Aaron. Hey, this is Mark Lawson, and again, Aaron, appreciate the opportunity to be part of the webinar. And I do think this topic is very important and one that impacts all institutions significantly at times. I've served in a real estate management facility roles in higher education for around 17 years at medium and large institutions. The company I started is primarily focused on higher education real estate, around real estate and facility management opportunities, and also in municipal and institutional sectors. But I did want to start my topic with the next slide. I just wanted to kind of set the tone for what I want to talk about. And as Aaron flipped it over, every institution, regardless of its size and location, engages in constant battle identifying issues within their buildings, maintaining an accurate condition assessment of their buildings in real time, and integrating facility data and other institutional department systems and platforms. Those are the key issues regarding this topic I think are important. It's very difficult at times to figure out what's going on in your buildings, but also how do you take that information that you do have and keeping it updated in real time, and then taking that information, putting it part together with the other institutional, from the budget side, from the user side, and from leadership side, so they know what's going on and what the cost would be. And I think Matt did a good job describing how the University of New Hampshire system does do that. Next slide, Aaron. One of the things that I think have been important in parts of my time in higher education working for universities is talking about the different ways issues are identified. So the key area typically is the one that you're most familiar with, is your building maintenance team, who's in the field all the time, looking at the buildings, maintaining things. As they're the eyes and ears of what's happening in your space, whether it's just a regular maintenance stop or an emergency call that they're dealing with issues in your building, and ideally updating you with what's happening. Also, hopefully, you've got a building capital repair plan, certainly campus-wide as well, and that's being updated on a regular basis, so that when you do make replacement repair projects, that they're being updated and maintained in a system that everybody can have access to. Also, as many of you probably have experienced, the leadership priorities can change from time to time, where you've been given one direction to maintain or do things a certain way, and then over time, maybe a different philosophical view appears, or a different key driver performance indexes you're trying to meet change, and it can move some of the items that you've identified in the building down or up, depending on what the issue is. And over time, depending on how you're managing that internally, it can create problems in certain buildings, and it can be tricky at times meeting the priority of the building, but also the expectation of the leadership and what they're looking to do. And it's one that we all struggle with. And then again, keeping updated building information based on all those changes can be tricky, and we'll talk more about that. And then the key point, though, and I think this is where it all gets to, is how do you adequately access that building information? Who has the data? Where is it stored? And how is it shared? Next slide. So I tried to summarize this in a couple different ways, and really broke it up into kind of three areas of visual inspection, industry standards, and utilizing consultants. I know I've experienced, and others as well, is oftentimes the first initial way you document is through a paper report. You create a document in a Word or Excel spreadsheet, and then at some point maybe there's an opportunity through your IT department, or you buy a product off the shelf that you can store this data and use it to maintain information. But at the end of the day, somebody's got to be there to make sure the data is being updated and is accurate and is being shared appropriately. But on the visual inspection side, again, your staff is the key eyes and ears of what's happening. Ideally, they're the most trusted source for data that you have. Also, what's interesting about this is a lot of times some staff are more technically sophisticated than others. So when they're maintaining a building, they may be able to do things beyond just regular maintenance and repairs and keep things moving along. And that's wonderful, but the challenge is if they were to be reassigned to a new building or move on and leave the institution, sometimes that institutional knowledge that they have walks out the door with them if it's not being documented somewhere else, and the person coming in behind them may not know what's really going on, and you can certainly lose information and data along that process. The other thing sometimes is on building familiarity. Sometimes there's situations where staff have been in a building for a very long time and are used to the ebbs and flows of the building and the users of the space. And sometimes you kind of miss things, not intentionally, it's just you're so familiar with how the building's functioning and operating, you may miss subtle changes over time. And sometimes it's important to have kind of an independent third party, whether it's a different staff, a different building manager, or even a third party company, come in and just do an overall assessment to make sure that nothing's slipping through the cracks. Talking about building industry standards, I think we've mentioned sightlines, but BOMA, APA, and ASHRAE also have recommended timeframes for replacing a roof or a mechanical system, and those are great benchmarks to help you do long-term planning and just do a validation against what you're visually seeing, as well as if you used a third-party consultant. But they're a good way to just have a secondary check as to what the condition of the building is and when your expectations that you'd like to be making changes or repairs and help with budgeting. On the consultants, and I think consultants definitely serve a viable role, and I think they can be your best friend, but they also can be a budget buster at times, depending on how and when you use them. They're a great process to come in and do a baseline assessment of a building, or if you've got a unique or highly technical building, maybe it's a research building or a more of a sophisticated high-end recreation center or dining facility that maybe not necessarily a regular academic building. It may be helpful to have somebody come in and kind of make an assessment of those unique features. And again, it's they're going to do a detailed report, give you a very thick copy of things you should do and think about, and certainly that's something that you should use. The challenge, as we've already talked about, is the cost. They can be very expensive, and depending on what size your budget is or the sophistication of your staff, you've got to balance that out of how you use those. The other subtle thing that I found over time is the reporting style of the consultant reports. Each one has their own way of doing it. They're obviously going to give you the information you need, but sometimes how it's presented is not easily sliced and diced to your formatting style that you already have in-house. Or if you're part of a larger state institution with a system office, they may have a certain reporting style that they would prefer that may not meet what you're trying to do. So you need to negotiate up front with the consultant exactly what information they're going to present, how they're going to present it, and they may actually give you a report in your system office report to meet both your expectations. But it's one of those things you want to think about on the front end, because once they complete it, it's very hard for them to go back and alter it. But again, I think those are the three primary ways that we collect data and are able to help project what the issues are going forward. Next slide. This is a lot of things go on here on this slide, but basically, how often is the data updated? After you've gone through assessing the building information, you kind of create a model. There's a process you need to think through in terms of how you're taking that information and adjusting it in a whether it's an Excel spreadsheet or it's in a database program in real time, and how you're actually adding to the list. You may identify things that weren't initially identified from previous studies or reports. The other item is how often do you do a full building assessment? There's so many different type of buildings on a university campus, whether it's a parking deck or recreation center, classroom building, a dining facility, housing. All of those have different potential life cycles based on how they're used. Some are more of a 24/7 operation. Some are used sporadically throughout the day. And again, you don't necessarily need to update those in a very detailed way at the same regular intervals. So you need to think through what's the appropriate time for a parking deck versus rec center, et cetera. And all of that kind of leads to how you're going to maintain your facility condition data. And part of what Matt was talking about is they have the information, it wasn't well suited for what they were doing, and it got old, and they had to figure out how do they bring that up to current standards and that's functional for them. And I think this is very key. So you've got a variety of sources of data coming in, whether it's from your facility staff, consultant reports, updated building drawings and plans. You may have internal Excel spreadsheets, and you're going to be working with somebody internally to manage that process. And you may use internal IT solution, may have a kind of a product they can develop or a third party, but it's key, whatever you use, that it's functional to what you need and that you can pull from it. And ideally, it's got more sophistication than that. I think the key, as Matt talked through earlier, is how do you have data that you can present to your leadership to help develop a future budget or capital plan, or if there's a surplus of funding it for year in a particular year, and we're looking for projects, how quickly could you put together a list that's accurate and up to date that can help get your projects move forward? The other thing, a part of this is, as you're going through the process, is how do you ensure that everybody has the most accurate information? There's certainly been times, I'm sure all of us have created a report of here's our list, sent it out. 6 months later, you're working on another list to update it, but somebody has old data sitting out there in the sphere of opportunity for them to look at other projects, and things get disconnected. So it's critical to have a central location for the data that you can maintain and manage. And also things happen as well in terms of you have your list, you've been meeting with your budget team, and there may be a president may come up with a different idea or vision of something they'd like to see. to enhance or an academic dean. And the more accurate information you have that you can help them understand where the priorities are and where the needs are, the better you can negotiate to try to keep your list and priorities on track to get done based on what needs to be done and incorporate what the areas they're bringing up. Obviously, if it's high enough priority, those things will happen, but the more accurate and well-maintained list you have, I think it's easier to make your case of why things need to get done. Next slide, or is that the last slide, Aaron? Here we go. I think I covered a little bit part of this, but again, it's kind of that cycle of getting in good data, maintaining it, making sure that you're constantly updating the list, having a person in charge, either a person or a system. And the other thing, and again, I think Matt talked about this well, is being able to share that information with other decision makers, whether it's leadership or budget, or even the users who want to know what's happening in those individual buildings.
Okay, thanks, Mark. That was great. I think one of the things that made me think of is that aside from providing the mobile tools to the kind of institutional people with the institutional knowledge on the campus themselves, we also license and have for a longer period of time offered the licenses to AEC firms, so those consultants you're talking about, the engineering firms, to do their condition assessments. And you mentioned the standardization of that data, and it's not often that I point to the government sector as leaders of innovation, but I've seen with a few municipalities and states and federal agencies where they mandate the data quality as far as here's the data that we want. They don't want the paper report anymore. They just say, here are the fields we want you to figure out, and here's the scale. So when they go out to tender, they can just compete on price, and they retain ownership of the data and keep it themselves, so they don't have to go through, they put the onus for aggregating that data and leveraging the historical data on the consultant to get more value out of that, as opposed to just having another file in the file cabinet to file away. So I see some questions coming in. We're about 15 minutes from the end of the presentation. So feel free to enter some last questions you have now. I'm just going to wrap up with a couple more examples, and then we'll move to the Q&A section. So I'm hoping this gives you some more ideas into how to look across your campus from a more holistic perspective, gives you some ideas as around what assets, which components, which systems, which buildings you may want to prioritize within that campus. There's some very interesting studies you can do on when you're trying to justify the request for capital renewal program, what backlog of deferred maintenance that may eliminate. So if you do modernize, you may get rid of a big backlog of deferred maintenance on some of the older buildings. I know, especially in USNH's example, having buildings that are 100 years old, as well as 1960s block buildings and some even new, very modern technology buildings, being able to manage those on kind of one set of priorities is kind of tricky, but there's a lot of flexible ways to do that. So as you have different initiatives, everything from student retention to energy, I know is a common one, and student safety is another common objective that comes up. You can reweight and reprioritize programmatically where you want to be allocating your resources. Here's an example, other than USNH, of some other schools whose data is on the Fortel platform. In some cases, these are where an engineering firm has used our mobile apps to do the assessment, and then on an ongoing basis, these universities update their capital plan on the platform. In other cases, these schools do self-assessments where they get the data on the platform and then offer the mobile tools to their campus staff to keep it up to date. And with that, we'll move to the Q&A section. These are the examples of some of the top queries that we get as far as what dashboards we kind of provide out of the box, and then they iterate from there. But I thought the best question that came in, the most relevant question that came in from the audience, was related to what Matt had pointed out about his FCI, the Facility Condition Index score. So he said USNH had a score of 24%, and for those of you who don't quite know what that is, it's essentially the backlog of deferred maintenance divided by the replacement value of the building gives you that KPI. And the question was, what key performance indicators are most important to you in your prioritization process? I thought I'd ask Matt or Mark if, other than FCI, are there any other key performance indicators that you would consider FCI is a very engineering term, so I'm curious, like in your domain, if there's other key performance indicators you look at.
Well, this is Matt, and we obviously, the inverse of that, which is the NAV, the net asset value, which is what the financial people on our board like to see rather than FCI. But that's the other indicator we'll present to them at times. But basically what we have also developed is we have even though a building has a higher FCI, we also need to look at what its strategic value is. And what we have developed is putting them into a scatter plot with the strategic value and assigning a strategic value to the buildings, and then being able to look at those compared to their deferred maintenance and their maintenance requirements, and put those into different bins of looking at them that way to understand which project should be of higher priority than others.
I would add, in terms of the key performance index indicators and whatnot, is sometimes looking at the building and the use. For example, if you maybe have a campus that's in an urban location and you've grown over time through acquisition as well as construction of new buildings, you may have users in a building that was designed for a different purpose, but for the foreseeable future, you're going to be in that building with that purpose, and you have to decide how much money do you invest in the short term and long term in that building. And you may have ratios that do not look favorable to keep the building, but if you look at the underlying need of having that space, as there's no other alternative, and what to do to repair and replace things, it may help you guide what to do if you're going to keep the building for 5, 10, or 15 or 20 years, or if you know in 10 years you're going to move into a new building. As well as if you're in a campus that has grown quickly and your users in terms of academic departments have grown or shrunk or moved around, you may be in a situation for the short term where you've got a use that would moving into a newer building, but you want to maintain this building for the next user. And so I think part of that challenge is explaining to the readers of the report why these numbers may not make sense on paper, but in reality, this is just the hand that's been dealt for that particular issue or that building.
Okay. I think you guys hit on something here, because we had a follow-up question from Amanda asking, what are you basing your strategic value criteria on?
The strategic value is based on the use and occupancy type. It also ties in back into some of the other criteria, which is looking at code issues and ADA compliance. So there's a myriad of different factors that go into that strategic valuation that we put on each of those.
All right, perfect. That's interesting. I mean, I think one of my favorite things about working with institutions of higher learning is that you have a long-term approach. So you're obviously holding on to these assets a long time. So the care and custody of that brings in opportunities for long-term strategic thinking that we don't really see in the commercial sector, where they focus on more of the aesthetic things and more of the transactional value. So I thought that was an interesting one. The other question we got in was, how would I get my data onto a database? My facilities maintenance team doesn't have the time. So I guess in reference to the USNH case study, we began with those engineering reports, so those spreadsheets. We updated those. We uploaded the sightlines reports, as well as provided the facilities team the mobile apps to gather their own information, not just the condition, but additional assets as you have new buildings and as-built put on there. But one of the most common requests we get is to just tie into the work order system. So typically there's a work order system which has a list of all the systems and components within these buildings, which you can use that as your baseline templates. And then ideally tying that out with your financial ERP system at the end, so you can track the actual costs of maintaining those assets. The other last question we had here was, how are priorities determined for funding capital projects such as lab renovations each year? Who and how are these decisions made? I can't answer that question, so I'm hoping one of you can.
Well, I mean, I could say how we do it at USNH. basically there's a on-campus committee that's composed of both academics and facilities personnel, and they're the ones who decide which are the higher priorities versus the others, and then tie that back into whatever the facilities conditions. So if we have a lab renovation going on in a building, we take a look back at what are our deferred maintenance in that building, issues in that building, and tie the two together. But basically, it's by committee, and fortunately, the committee really cooperates really well on the campuses. They understand what the criteria are, and in UNH's perspective, they've really been very clear on what the criteria are.
You had a follow-up question again, Matt. You're on a roll with. Is there a particular cycle within the school year that is best to conduct this type of work?
It's on an annual basis. In fact, it's going on right now. It's going on. It basically starts next week and goes to the end of December, at which point we're pulling together our capital plans for presentation next April to our Board of Trustees for approval. So it's annually done, and if there's there's always outliers. Somebody suddenly gets a grant to do a major research project, and then oftentimes those projects will come to the top of the prioritization list.
I've been involved in a number of those are the fun sprints, right? So how quickly can we come up with how we could spend this money? That's like a Brewster's Million scenario, which not everyone's as fortunate to have, but we've been involved in a few of those, and they're a lot of fun. I had another question around. It says, do you find that colleges typically hire AEC firms to conduct FCAs, or are they done in-house? I think I can answer that. Just historically, I know that it's mostly been hiring external firms. It helps to have that objectivity as well as that stamp of a certified engineer when you're looking at your civil and structural pieces. I think to Matt's point around the diminishing margin return on doing that year after year, once you have your baseline captured, may not merit that expense, especially if you have your own institutional team that has some legacy knowledge of how the assets have been used and maintained. To Mark's point, you may want to bring in specialists to look at specific things like code compliance, security, energy, but as far as maintaining the overall data for calculating your FCA and priorities, most of that knowledge lives within the institution. So I imagine that once you have the right combination of techniques and tools, the ongoing programmatic use can be with your own in-house staff. I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that.
I would concur.
Yep, that's the same on our campuses.
Okay, great. Well, there's no more questions coming in at this point. I know we're about 54 minutes in, so there's 6 minutes left if anyone has any last questions, or I can give you back a little piece of your afternoon with some lunch and clearing your deck for the long weekend. We did have one last question, which was just what systems can you pull information from? We do have a rather large list of that. Most commercially available CMMS systems, which are the work order systems, either have an API configured. We essentially run on a SQL relational database, which is hosted on a Microsoft cloud, so you can connect pretty much everything to that. Worst comes to worst, you can also just export spreadsheets and import those, and then the trick is just identifying which fields you want to map to and coming up with a common denominator for how to identify those assets. So if you either barcode scan things or have a general ledger code from your ERP system, that usually is enough to do that. And then I'm getting one more question around TMA systems, which I'm not familiar with, so I'll have to follow up with you offline. And architectural drawings, yeah. So moving from maintenance to the beginning of the life cycle of buildings, that's the best place to be as far as getting that as-built inventory from the beginning, so that can live with the building over time. It's easier to get everything connected at the beginning than to go back and retrospect and try to understand, was this system or component part of the original build, or was it was it there from a refurbishment or renovation? Definitely that's a great idea. If you have as-built from the designs or engineers and architects, uploading those is a perfect place to start. And I think that's it. So Matt or Mark, do you have any closing thoughts before I give you back 4 minutes of your weekend?
This is Mark.
No,
Opportunity.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, go ahead. This is Mark. I just appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, same here. And if anybody ever has any questions, always feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, I appreciate it both. Thanks for everyone's time this afternoon. There will be, for everyone who registered, we'll send you a recording of this as well as the USNH case study and the white paper that Mark put together. And with their permission, I'll provide some contact information in that collateral as well. And we're always looking for new ideas for webinars. A lot of this came from the SCUP conference down in Nashville. And a lot of the attendees on the call today were from there. So if there's any other topics we didn't get to today or things you would like to see us address, please follow up with your ideas and we will put some resources and some data behind it. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good long weekend.
Great, thank you.